The seceding brethren justly observe that the Assembly 1734 in their act anent them give full power to the Synod of Perth to take the case of the four brethren as it then stood under their consideration, and to proceed and do therein as they shall find most justifiable and expedient for restoring the peace and preserving the authority of this church. Quote, "But with this express direction, that said synod shall not take upon them to judge the legality or formality of the former proceedings of the church judicatories in relation to this affair, or either to approve or censure the same. The brethren justly argue that from the above express direction of the Assembly at the Synod of Perth and Stirling, it is plain that the Act of Assembly 1733 and the proceedings of their commission thereupon are no wise affected by the Act of Assembly 1734, either as to their legality or formality. That is, they are held in repute to be formal and legal deeds by the said Assembly, and the Synod of Perth is bound up from disapproving or censuring them. And when the Assembly 1734 did neither disapprove nor condemn the foresaid proceedings against the brethren, it is plain the Synod could not. And though the Synod had disapproven, and condemned them, when they are expressly discharged by the Assembly so to do, yet the Act of the Assembly 1733 must still be reckoned a deed of this church, neither materially nor formally rescinded to this day. For an inferior judicatory can never repeal an act and sentence passed by a superior, while they continue in conjunction with and subordination to them. If it is then inquired, what the powers given by the Assembly 1734 to the Synod of Perth, what are the powers, given by the Assembly 1734 to the Synod of Perth, I answer, the Synod of Perth are only empowered to relax the four brethren upon some political considerations from the sentences that were passed against them, that is, for preventing the, quote, lamentable consequences that have followed and may yet follow upon their separation from this church and the judicatories thereof, unquote. And in the meantime, the act and deed of the Assembly 1733 against them is held and reputed to be legal and formal, and is no wise to be censured by the Synod, and the Synod have accordingly relaxed them from the sentences pronounced and executed against them. And this was all that was done, or could be done by the Synod in consequence of the powers committed to them. I may here likewise observe that the last Assembly, 1738, gave us the sense that the present judicatories have the Act of Assembly 1734, when they mention it in the preamble to their act anent the seceding ministers, as an aggravating circumstance of their continued secession, that this is done notwithstanding the clemency showed to some of them in the year 1734. The seceding ministers have always pled for the repeal of the deed 1733 against them, not as an act of favor or pity, unto them as straying brethren who deserve such a sentence, but as an act of justice, and that they have pled the repeal of the said deed not merely as an act of justice to themselves, but as a piece of justice that should be done to injured truth, namely, that an act and sentence condemning a faithful doctrinal testimony against steps of defection, and likewise condemning a protestation against the unwarrantable exercise of the key of discipline, might not remain to future generations as a standing act and deed of this national church. When the author of the essay cites some of our words, but never touches the above reason why we judge the Act of Assembly 1733 was never yet repealed either materially or formally, the most favorable construction that I could put upon his conduct was that he appeared to me not to have understood the argument. He seems to be offended at this, and insinuates in his short vindication that it is a bringing into question his intellectuals. But if he took up the force of our reasoning, and took no manner of notice of the same, which I have shown he has not, then he waived it industriously and with design, and thereby imposes upon his credulous reader, when he conceals the weight and strength of our reason from him, that this was what I was very loath to impute upon him. From what is above observed, it is evident that the Act of Assembly 1733 is a standing act and deed of this national church, never yet rescinded nor repealed. Therefore I shall not weary the reader with tracing our author further in the answers he makes to the several citations, which after his own way he transcribes from our reasons, and not accession. In regard, he never once touches the argument, as the reader may find, if he thinks it worth his while to compare with the foresaid reasons the citations taken from them The citation is taken from them, essay page 168, 169, and 170. If I should tell our author that in some of those he has perverted our words as much as in the above citation which I have examined, or that he has concealed the force of our reasoning in every one of them, I expect no other answer from him than that he has given what he takes to be the substance of our complaint, though not precisely our words. It is like some may judge, that it is not of any great importance in the present question whether the Act of Assembly 1733 against the four brethren was rescinded or not when the execution of the sentence against them was diverted. But it will be found to be of considerable moment and importance when it is observed that by the act and deed of the said assembly a doctrinal testimony against the sinful proceedings of the judicatories is censured, and thereby faithful ministerial freedom against a course of defection, as also a protestation for exoneration against such a gross perverting of the keys of discipline, are both condemned, by which procedure I humbly judge that not only our principles as Presbyterians, but also as Protestants, are attacked, and a blind submission and subjection unto judicatories, even when walking contrary to our laudable acts and constitutions, is established. And as this is a piece of manifest tyranny in the administration, so it has a native tendency to subvert our Constitution. With respect to ministerial freedom, in testifying doctrinally against the sinful proceedings of church judicatories, it is plainly condemned by the Act of Assembly 1733, appointing Mr. Erskine to be rebuked at their bar for impugning in his sermon acts of assembly and proceedings of church judicatories. And what were these acts or deeds of assembly and proceedings of the judicatories which he impugned? Only such as concern the violent settlements of ministers and vacant congregations in direct opposition to our received and known principles. But it is alleged that the assembly, 1734, have declared for ministerial freedom in the plainest terms, when in their act relative to the same, quote, they do for the satisfaction of all hereby declare that due and regular ministerial freedom is still left entire to all ministers, and that the same was not, nor shall be, held or understood to be anywise impaired or restrained by the late Assembly's decision in that particular process, unquote, that is, in the process against Mr. Erskine. Upon the above words of the Assembly, the seceding brethren justly observe in their reasons of not acceding, page 35, that they are conceived in very general terms, that they have not told us what they mean by due and regular ministerial freedom, and that it is plain that according to the Act of Assembly 1733, the doctrinal freedom used by Mr. Erskine, and the freedom which the four brethren used in protesting for the faithful and free exercise of their ministry, was neither due nor regular ministerial freedom in the plain sense and meaning of the foresaid Act of Assembly, and therefore they justly conclude that the Assembly 1734, instead of taking off the restraint that was laid upon ministerial freedom, do rather approve and vindicate the Act and Deed of Assembly 1733, when they expressly declare, quote, that due and regular ministerial freedom was not anywise impaired or restrained by the decision of the said Assembly in this particular process, unquote. But, says the author of the essay, quote, this is not a matter of fact, page 171, for it is a plain ministerial representation of the words of the General Assembly 1734 upon this head, for that Assembly never says ministerial freedom was not anywise impaired by the Act 1733, unquote. What then do they say? Oh, says our author, they declare, quote, for the satisfaction of all, that due and regular ministerial freedom is still left entire to all ministers, and that the same was not, nor shall be held or understood to be anywise impaired or restrained by the late Assembly's decision, unquote. That is, against Mr. Erskine and the other three ministers. Let the reader now judge for himself, on whose side the plain misrepresentation on this head lies. It is but a very sorry evasion when the author of the essay adds, quote, as that Assembly 1734 declares for ministerial freedom in the plainest terms, so when they say due and regular ministerial freedom was not held or understood to be anywise impaired by that decision, that Assembly might mean no more, but only that they judged that the Assembly 1733 did not design to restrain due and regular ministerial freedom by that act. And so much the principal men concerned in framing thereof did declare, unquote. It seems our author was at an uncertainty about the meaning of the assembly when he tells us they might mean no more. But to relieve himself of this uncertainty, he has got out the secret design and meaning of the principal men, etc. And after all, what is the great discovery that he has made? It is even this, that they did not, in framing the Act 1733, design to restrain due and regular ministerial freedom by that act. And who doubts that the principal men would make this declaration? But have they told our author what they reckon due and regular ministerial freedom? Or rather, if he had inquired a little further into the meaning of the principal men, he might have found that Mr. Erskine's doctrinal freedom and the freedom used by the four protesting ministers was, in their reckoning, neither due nor regular ministerial freedom. Yea, our author, if he pleases, may see it with his own eyes from their act and sentence. For if they had reckoned otherwise, they would never have passed such an act and sentence against the four ministers. From all that is above observed, it is evident that the present judicatories are tyrannical in their administration, insofar as they condemn doctrinal freedom against a course of defection, and have thrust out some ministers from communion with them merely for protestings, for their own just and necessary exoneration against an unjust sentence restraining ministerial freedom and faithfulness, whereby the key of discipline is subverted, and the ordinances of the King of Zion are changed, and the covenant of Levi is corrupted by the above conduct and the administration of the present judicatories. Fourthly, a fourth instance I give of tyranny in the administration is, that by the acts and constitutions of the present judicatories, such of the Lord's people as live in parishes where ministers are intruded upon them, are required to submit to the ministry of such intruders, yea, they are upon the matter excommunicate from sealing ordinances, if they do not submit to their ministry. This is done by the Act of Assembly 1733 concerning some ministers in the Presbytery of Dunfermline, whereby the ministers of that presbytery are inhibit and discharge to admit any of the path of Kinross to the sealing ordinances, without the consent of the intruder into that parish, under the pain of the highest censure. It is alleged by the author of the essay, in vindication of the present judicatories, page 34, quote, that the Assembly 1735 allowed some of these parishes, who had pastors thrust in upon them, the liberty of church privileges wherever they might have freedom to ask them, which, says he, was a material testimony against intrusions, unquote. And in page 173 he alleges that the foresaid act is, quote, materially rescinded in regard the assembly left it to the Synod of Fife to do in the affair of Kinross, as to admitting that people to partake of church privileges as they should think fit. And, says he, quote, the Synod of Fife did, upon this, allow that people to have the benefit of church privileges wherever they should think meet to ask them, unquote. But I have evinced in the postscript to the printed letter that the Assembly 1735 gave no such allowance to the terms reported by our author. I have likewise observed that the same Assembly did in like manner refer the case about the enrollment of the intruders in some of these parishes to the respective synods, and in consequence of this remit, the Synod of Perth and Stirling did actually enroll the intruder into the parish of Muckhart. Hence, even according to our author's way of reasoning, that assembly was so far from giving material testimony against intrusions that they have both materially and formally countenanced them by allowing synods to enroll intruders. But I refer to what is more fully said upon this head in the foresaid postscript, where I have made it evident that the Act of Assembly and at the ministers of Dunfermline Presbytery is still a standing act and deed of this church, and it may be afterwards evidenced that the key of discipline is thereby perverted, and that it is a considerable piece of tyranny in the present administration.